itself together. It's Konami's Contra Hardcore for Sega Genesis.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Player One Start. Today we're going to talk about Contra Hardcore for the Sega Genesis. Before we get too far into it, don't forget if you haven't clicked that like and subscribe button yet, to please do so before the end of this video. But that said, let's go ahead and dive into the history. After Contra 3 The Alien Wars, the next foray into Contra would be, again on the NES in 1992, with Contra Force. However, this game faced two major problems when it was released. First, it was released on a console that many in North America considered dead. With the 16-bit console wars in full swing, it was either the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo. People were still years away from fondly remembering the good times they had with their good old Nintendo Entertainment System, so many would sell off their console, and others would stuff it into the closet as they got a new system. The second major problem was the fact that this game was actually not even a Contra game at all. It was rebranded as Contra Force before its release, but it was not intended to be a part of that series. Add to the fact that this game would only be released in North America, as it would not be released in Japan, where the Famicom was still quite popular, or Europe. That makes this game rare and expensive today to collect. In the early part of the 16-bit console war, if you wanted to play a Capcom or Konami game, you had to play them on Nintendo. Part of this was due to an exclusivity agreement that all third-party developers had to agree to when making games for the console, and another part is that Nintendo was the most successful brand by far in video games, at least until the early 90s. After an antitrust lawsuit against Nintendo, which they would lose, and the rise of consoles such as the Sega Genesis, third-party developers began to publish their games on other systems. Konami announced that in 1994, two of their most beloved franchises, Castlevania and Contra, would get an entry on the Sega Genesis. The game would first be released in North America in August of 1994. As with the games before it, Contra would be renamed Probopotector for the Mega Drive in Europe. The game would also receive slight alterations to tone down the violence. Upon its release, the game received mixed to positive reviews, with many praising the impressive bosses, eye-catching graphics, explosions, which they say test the limits of the TV speakers, simple control configuration, and intense action. And even until the modern day, many still call this the best of the Contra series. So Contra Hardcore is a hard game to find for the Sega Genesis because it is a bit more on the rare side, so that also means it's a little bit more expensive. However, in the past couple of months, there has actually been a couple of releases that makes it a bit more accessible for the rest of us. One of those re-releases this year was on the Contra Anniversary Collection that came out for various platforms, including the Nintendo Switch where I bought it, and this game came out on the Sega Genesis Mini Console. So let's go ahead and dive into the gameplay and see what this game is all about. When first starting the game, you are directed to select a player. This seems to be a carryover from the Contra Force game that was the first one to allow you to select your player. After selecting your player, you're taken to the mission screen in which they describe the plot of the game. The game takes place about 5 years after the events of the Alien Wars. A terrorist group, led by the renegade Colonel Bahamut, has stolen an alien cell recovered from the war and now intends to use it to produce weapons. And instead of taking the role of the traditional heroes of the Contra series, a new set of heroes, known as the Hardcore Task Force, are sent to deal with the situation. And then the game begins. Something that I noticed throughout the entire gameplay is how everything seems to run a bit faster. Bullets fly faster, enemies come in faster, and the explosions are faster as well. The objective of each stage of the game is to reach the end by shooting every enemy that gets in the way, and fight the boss awaiting at the end. Along the way, you can pick up power-ups such as different weapons, which no longer have a letter that corresponds to their name, but just a letter corresponding to the slot that you hold them in. Be careful though, because when you die, you lose the weapon that you had equipped at that time. You can also pick up bombs as well, however, unlike in Contra 3, they do not replenish when you die. Instead, you still have the same amount when you come back to life. But anyway, stage 1 doesn't really seem to break the mold too much, as you are fighting through just to get past all the enemies so you can get to the final boss of the stage. I must say, seeing the boss in the background destroy almost the entire city and then jump right in front of you was a bit terrifying back in the day. I also thought it was kind of weird how the robot almost seems to dance with the music in between the time that it's firing at you. But believe it or not, even after defeating this boss, it is not the end of this first stage. Instead, you have to keep making your way through until you reach Dead-Eyed Joe. And even still, this boss fight has 2 parts. In the first part of this fight, you basically have to avoid getting hit while you try to fire off shots whenever you can. The second half of this fight starts when you do enough damage and his torso detaches from the rest of his body. Again, you need to avoid taking hits while attacking his body as it floats around the screen. After defeating this enemy and watching a short little cutscene, something unique happens that has not yet happened in a Contra game, at least up until the time this game was released. That's right, as you can choose your own adventures somewhat throughout the game, there are multiple endings and different ways you can play through this game. I'll tell you what though, just getting through the first stage in itself is quite a challenge, and playing this game as a kid, I almost never made it past the first stage. In fact, I think the farthest I ever remember getting is this robot scene here, which I think is some of the most impressive graphics that the Sega Genesis offers without any of its add-ons. Keep in mind that the Genesis has no way of scaling or rotating sprites, or any of the background layers, so the fact that they were able to accomplish all of this with the stock Genesis is very impressive. But thanks to some unlimited lives, I am going to be able to make it through this game a little bit farther than I normally do. In the next stage, you end up fighting a whole bunch of different virtual enemies. And to tell you the truth, this whole battle kind of reminds me of what maybe inspired Cuphead. In the first part of this battle, you're battling against different constellations, then you fight against the world's hardest version of Tetris, which eventually turns itself into a tank, and then finally a helicopter. The next level is extremely long, and even though this game is difficult from the get-go, it ramps up the difficulty pretty big here. The second half of this level is just this cat-and-mouse game you play with this robot that keeps going back and forth. And if you can survive that long, you eventually find out that you walked into a trap from the Colonel. The next boss battle has him whip up his 11 herbs and spices into some freakishly mutated enemies. And so we don't spoil a lot of the gameplay that follows after this, I'm going to go ahead and end this gameplay run here. Alright, so what are my thoughts on Contra Hardcore? First, the graphics and sound are some of the best on the system, and I have to say that I was actually a little bit blown away playing this game in modern times, and I definitely was when I played this game way back in the day. I never owned this game up until I started collecting game consoles. In fact, I didn't actually own this game until this year, right before they announced the Sega Genesis mini console. But this game was a constant weekend rental for me, and I never made it very far into the game because, well, this game is very hard. In terms of the Contra series, it's known for its legendary difficulty, but I think it's pumped up to 11, especially in this version. As a kid, I never really made it far past the first level, and even with cheat codes, I found myself frequently dying to the point where I'm like, alright, I need to get better at this game before I even try to complete it. Eventually, I was able to beat this game, but I'm still not able to do it without cheat codes. So in terms of the complete package, I think this game is very well done and is on the better of the Contra series, but I think that difficulty combined with, how much am I going to invest in this game in modern times, makes me rank it just below Contra 3, Super C, and the original Contra. That's purely nostalgia driven because I've played Super C and Contra 3 more than I played any of the other games, so of course I'm a little bit better at them because I've kind of memorized the patterns over the years. Do I think this is a bad game? I think it's far from it. And yes, I would definitely recommend playing this game, especially now that it's more accessible. If this game was still on the rare side, I would say it's only for the hardcore collectors, fans of the Contra genre or the shooters in general. A modern game I kept thinking of was Cuphead. Cuphead has a little bit less of the run and gun that this game has, but they have the boss battles that I think were probably directly inspired by this game. So that said, I think this offers a fun experience, but it's not one that I think you'll have to take to conclusion to get your fun and enjoyment out of it. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys thought about today's review in the comments below and what you guys think of Contra Hardcore. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I guess I'll see you next time. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.